After a moment's reflection, I decided not to retrace my steps. Away from the draught, I would have no landmarks, for the roughly level rock floor was devoid of distinctive configurations. If, however, I followed up the strange current, I would undoubtedly arrive at an aperture of some sort, from whose gate I could perhaps work round the walls to the opposite side of the cyclopean and otherwise unnavigable hall. That I might fail, I well realized. I saw that this was no part of Kefren's gateway temple, which tourists know, and it struck me that this particular hall might be unknown even to archaeologists. I merely stumbled upon by the inquisitive and malignant Arabs who had imprisoned me. If so, was there any present gate of escape to the unknown parts or to the outer air? What evidence indeed did I now possess that this was the gateway temple at all? For a moment all my wildest speculations rushed back upon me, and I thought of that vivid melange of impressions. Descent, suspension in space, the rope, my wounds, and the dreams that were frankly dreams. Was this the end of life for me? Or indeed would it be merciful if this moment were the end? I could answer none of my own questions, but merely kept on until fate, for a third time, reduced me to oblivion. This time there were no dreams, for the suddenness of the incident shocked me out of all thought, either conscious or subconscious. Tripping on an unexpected descending step at a point where the offensive drought became strong enough to offer an actual physical resistance, I was precipitated headlong down a black flight of huge stone stairs into a gulf of hideousness unrelieved. That I ever breathed again is a tribute to the inherent vitality of the healthy human organism. Often I looked back that night and I felt a touch of actual humor in those repeated lapses of consciousness. Lapses whose succession reminded me of, at the time, of nothing more than the crude cinema melodramas of that period. Of course, it is possible that the repeated lapses never occurred and all that features of that underground nightmare were merely the dreams of one long coma which began with the shock of my descent into that abyss and ended with the healing balm of the outer air and of the rising sun which found me stretched on the sands of the Giza before the sardonic and dawn-flushed face of the great Sphinx. I prefer to believe the latter explanation as much as I can. Hence I was glad when the police told me that the barrier to Kefren's gateway temple had been found unfastened, and that a sizable rift to the surface did actually exist. In one corner of the still buried part. I was glad too when the doctors pronounced my wounds only those expected from my seizure, blindfolding, lowering, struggling with bonds, falling some distance, perhaps into depression in the temple's inner gallery, dragging myself to the outer barrier and escaping from it. And experiences like that, a very soothing diagnosis. And yet I know that there must be more than appears on the surface. That extreme descent is too vivid a memory to be dismissed, and it is odd that no one has ever been able to find a man answering the description of my guide, Abdul Rees al-Drogman, the tomb-throated guide who looked and smiled like King Kefren. I have digressed from my connected narrative, perhaps in the vain hope of evading the telling of that final incident, that incident which of all is most certainly an hallucination. But I promised to relate it. I did not break promises. When I recovered, or seemed recovered, my senses after that fall down the black stone stairs, I was quite alone as in dark as before. The windy stench, bad enough before, was now fiendish, yet I had acquired enough familiarity by this time to bear it stoically. Dazedly I began to crawl away from the place whence the putrid wind came, and with my bleeding hands felt the colossal blocks of a mighty pavement. Once my head struck against a hard object, and when I felt of it, I learned that it was the base of a column of unbelievable immensity, whose surface was covered with gigantic chiseled hieroglyphics, very perceptible to my touch. Crawling on, I encountered other Titan columns at incomprehensible distances apart, when suddenly my attention was captured by the realization of something which must have been impinging on my subconscious, hearing long before the conscious sense was aware of it. From some still lower chasm in Earth's bowels were proceeding certain sounds, measured and definite, and like nothing I had ever heard before. That they were very ancient and distinctly ceremonial, I felt almost intuitively, and much reading in Egyptology led me to associate them with the flute, the sambuc, the sistrum, and the tympanum. In their rhythmic piping, droning, rattling, and beating, I felt an element of terror beyond all the known terrors of Earth, a terror peculiarly dissociated from personal fear and taking the form of a sort of objective pity for our planet, that it should hold within us its depths such horrors as must lie beyond those Egypanic cacophonies. The sounds increased in volume, and I felt that they were approaching. Then, and may all the gods of all the pantheons unite to keep the like from my ears again, I began to hear, faintly and far off, the morbid and millennial tramping of the marching things. It was hideous that footfalls so dissimilar should move in such perfect rhythm. The training of unhallowed thousands of years must lie behind that march of Earth's inmost monstrosities, padding, clicking, walking, stalking, rumbling, lumbering, crawling, and all to the abhorrent discords of those mocking instruments. And then, God keep the memory of those Arab legends out of my head. The mummies without souls, the meeting place of wandering Khas, the hordes of the devil-cursed pharaonic dead of 40 centuries. The composite mummies led through the uttermost onyx voids by King Khephren and his gold queen, Nitocris. The trampling drew nearer. Heaven save me from the sound of those feet and the paws and hooves and pads and talons as it commenced to acquire detail. Down limitless reaches of sunless pavement, a spark of light flickered in the malodorous wind. And I drew behind the enormous circumference of a cyclopic column that I might escape for a while of the horror that was stalking million-footed toward me. Through gigantic hippostyles of inhuman dread and phobic antiquity. The flickers increased, and tramping and dissonant rhythm grew sickeningly loud. In the quivering orange light there stood faintly forth a scene of such stony awe that I gasped from sheer wonder that I conquered and even fear and repulsion. Bases of columns whose middles were higher than human sight, mere bases of things that must each dwarf the Eiffel Tower to insignificance. Hieroglyphics carved by unthinkable hands in caverns where daylight can only be a remote legend. I would not look at the marching things that I desperately resolved as I heard their creaking joints and nitrous wheezing above the dead music and the dead tramping. It was merciful that they did not speak, but God, their crazy torches begun to cast shadows on the surface of the stupendous columns. Heaven take it away! Hippopotami should not have human heads and carry torches. Men should not have the heads of crocodiles. I tried to turn away, but the shadows and the sounds and the stench were everywhere. Then I remembered something I used to do in half-consciousness nightmares as a boy, and began to repeat to myself, "This is a dream. This is a dream." But it was of no use, and I could only shut my eyes and pray. At least, that is what I think I did, for one is never sure in visions. And I know this can have been nothing more. I wondered whether I should ever reach the world again, and at times would furtively open my eyes to see if I could discern any feature of the place other than the wind of spiced putrefaction, the topless columns, and the thaumatropically grotesque shadows of abnormal horror. The sputtering glare of multiplying torches now shone, and unless this hellish place were wholly without walls, I could not fail to see some boundary or fixed landmark soon. But I had to shut my eyes again when I realized how many of the things were assembling, and when I glimpsed a certain object walking solemnly and steadily without any body above the waist. A fiendish and ululent corpse gurgle or death rattle now split the very atmosphere. The charnel atmosphere poisonous with naphtha and bitumen blasts. In one concerted chorus from the ghoulish legion of hybrid blasphemies, my eyes perversely shaken open, gazed for an instant upon a sight which no human creature could even imagine without panic, fear, and physical exhaustion. The things had filed ceremoniously in one direction, the direction of the noisome wind, where the light of their torches showed their bended heads, or the bended heads of such as had heads. They were worshipping before a great black foder-belching aperture which reached up almost out of sight, and which I could see was flanked at right angles by two giant staircases whose ends were far away in shadow. One of these was indubitably the staircase I had fallen down. The dimensions of the hall were fully in proportion with those of the columns. An ordinary house would have been lost in it, and any average public building could easily have been moved in and out. It was so vast a surface that only by moving the eye could one trace its boundaries, so vast, so hideously black, and so aromatically stinking. Directly in front of this yawning polyphemus door, the things were throwing objects, evidently sacrifices or religious offerings to judge by their gestures. Kephren was their leader, sneering King Kephren, or the guide, Abdul Rees, crowned with a golden pheasant, and intoning endless formulae with the hollow voice of the dead. By his side knelt beautiful Queen Nitocris, whom I saw in profile for a moment, noting that the right half of her face was eaten away by rats or other ghouls. As I shut my eyes again when I saw what objects were being thrown as offerings to the photo aperture or its possible local deity, it occurred to me that judging from the elaborateness of this worship, the concealed deity must be one of considerable importance. Was it Osiris or Isis, Horus or Anubis, or some vast unknown god of the dead, still more central and supreme? There's a legend that terrible altars and colossi were reared to an unknown one before ever the known gods were worshipped. And now, so I steeled myself to watch the rapt and sepulchral adorations of those nameless things. A thought of escape flashed upon me. The hall was dim, and the columns heavy with shadow. With every creature of that nightmare throng absorbed in shocking raptures, it might be barely possible for me to creep past to the faraway end of the staircases, one of the staircases, and ascend unseen, trusting to fate and skill to deliver me from the upper reaches. Where I was, I knew neither nor seriously reflected upon, and for a moment it struck me as amusing to plan a serious escape from that which I knew to be a dream. Was I in some hidden and unsuspected lower realm of Khephr's gateway temple, the temple which generations have persistently called Temple of the Sphinx? I could not conjecture, but I resolved to ascend to life and consciousness if wit and muscle could carry me. Wriggling flat on my stomach, I began the anxious journey toward the foot of the left-hand staircase, which seemed the more accessible of the two. I cannot describe the incidents and sensations of that crawl, but they may be guessed when one reflects on what I had to watch steadily in that malign, wind-blown torchlight in order to avoid detection. The bottom of the staircase was, as I've said, far away in shadow as it had to be to rise without a bend to the dizzy parapeted landing above the Titanic aperture. This placed the last stages of my crawl at some distance from the noisome herd, though the spectacle chilled me even when quite remote at my right. At length I succeeded in reaching the steps and began to climb, keeping close to the wall on which I observed decorations of the most hideous sort, and relying for safety on the absorbed ecstatic interest with which the monstrosity watched the foul breeze aperture and the impious objects of its nourishment that had flung on the pavement before it. Though the staircase was huge and deep and fashioned of vast porphyry blocks as if for the feet of a giant, the ascent seemed virtually interminable. Dread of discovery and the pain which renewed exercise had brought to my wounds combined to make that upward crawl a thing of agonizing memory. I had intended, on reaching the landing, to climb immediately onward along whatever upper staircase might mount from there, stopping for no last look at the carrion abominations that pawed and genuflected some 70 or 80 feet below, Yet a sudden repetition of that thunderous corpse gurgle and death rattle chorus, coming as I nearly gained from the top of this flight, and showing by its ceremonial rhythm that it was not an alarm of my discovery, caused me to pause and peer cautiously over the parapet.